Alright, so I have some good news and I have some bad news. I'll tell you the good news first. The band we're talking about today, aka Citizen, is an incredible band, and their album Youth that we'll be discussing is an absolute masterpiece. But here's the bad news. Citizen will never, and I mean never, release an album like Youth ever again. And that's one of the many reasons why I love Citizen so much. They keep me fully engaged. They keep me on my toes like a kid that's trying so hard to be tall enough for the ride. And they always have me guessing what's to come next. You know, after a successful album, some bands tend to stagnate and get a little stale, like when you leave a bag of pretzels open overnight, but Citizen literally does the exact opposite of this. Citizen is like one of those food savers, always keeping things fresh. Every album that they release is like opening up one of those giant goldfish boxes that's shaped like a milk carton. You just stuff your nose in there, inhale the cheesy, baked freshness, and then grab out a handful and stuff those suckers in your mouth as you're overcome by euphoria and nostalgia. So if you clicked on this video, I trust that you already know who Citizen is, and I won't waste your time telling you boring, useless facts about them, like how they're a rock band that formed in 2009 in Toledo, Ohio, is signed to Run for Cover Records and consists of Matt, Nick, Jake, Ryland, and Eric, because I know you already know all of that. But as the title of this video suggests, I am going to talk to you about their debut album, Youth. We're going to talk about the timing of the release and how I think that impacted its success. We're gonna chit chat about the reception the album received, not so much from music critics, but just the reception from your average music listener, and at the end I'll go into detail on why I love this album so dang much. Are you ready? In 5,
4, 3, 2.
Back in the early days of Citizen, the group was largely considered a pop-punk band, which I never felt was a super accurate way to describe them, but I could see why some people would place their older work in that category. I just find it so incredibly interesting that Citizen was able to basically use pop-punk as a springboard for their career, when by and large their music isn't pop-punk. And when I say that Citizen used pop-punk as a springboard for their career, in no way is that meant to be disparaging or attempting to discredit them. Like I said, I'm just so fascinated that pop-punk was what got their initial momentum going, because they're just not a pop-punk band. However, as Citizen was on the come-up, so were a lot of pop-punk bands. In fact, a whole wave of pop-punk was more or less just getting started. You know the bands I'm talking about: Real Friends, Knuckle Puck, Neck Deep, State Champs, A Story So Far, Man Overboard, The Wonder Years, all that stuff. Pretty much all of those bands were just kicking off their careers, and Citizen was in a pretty similar place. So they were able to network, become friends with these bands, tour with these bands, and by doing so, Citizen was able to become extremely popular within this wave of pop punk, even though that wasn't the style they were playing. And Citizen isn't the only band who has had an experience like this. Bands like Balance and Composure and Sea Haven were very prominent in the world of pop punk for a while, and I always found that very interesting, because neither of those bands are pop punk at their core. A modern day example of something like this would be Movements. If anything, I'd say Movements falls more under the post-hardcore / emo umbrella, but kids that love pop punk love Movements. From my perspective, it seems at times that pop punk isn't so much a genre, but almost just like a vague, intangible concept, almost kind of like an overall attitude or an emotion / feeling. And trust me, I know that's not the case at all, but sometimes that's the way that I think about it. So Youth came out early June, right? Citizen had already accrued a steady following over the years. They were able to add flame to that fire by touring with The Story So Far before embarking on their largest and most important adventure yet, the Vans Warped Tour. So not only was Citizen about to go on the tour of their dreams, but they were also releasing their first full-length album as a band right before Warped Tour kicked off. Everything just seemed to line up so perfectly, because not only were they about to have the most attention on them that they've ever had, but all of that attention would be on their newest and best work, that work being Youth, of course. I'll never forget seeing them that year at Warped 2013. Their singer Matt had a very different stage presence, like very different. And there's actually video footage of the exact date that I went to in 2013, so you can see what I'm talking about. Pretty freaking dope, huh? I'm not gonna sit here and lie to you, mates. I remember seeing Citizen that day, and in my head I was thinking, like all sarcasm aside, I was thinking, those are some of the sickest stage moves I have ever seen. I don't think Youth could have possibly been presented to a better crowd, right? Like, it was so ideal. Just think about it. The album is sad. Kids that go to Warped Tour love things that are sad. The album is literally named Youth, and everyone that goes to Warped Tour is young, or at least has a youthful spirit, right? The cover of the album is minimalist and aesthetic, which is an easy sell for any Warped goer. And to top it all off, track 3 of this album is called The Summer dude. This album was literally made for Warped Tour. I still think this album would have been highly successful even without the ideal timing, but I do think the state of the scene accompanied with a successful Warped Tour run was the sauce that they needed to kickstart their potential career into motion. After Warped 2013 and a successful LP1, Citizen has been working non-stop on music, touring, being a band. These guys work really hard. Given the fact that for the first chunk of their career, Citizen was a non-pop punk band that was extremely loved and cared for in a pop punk world, I was sort of concerned as to how Youth would do in terms of reception. And I don't mean reception from music critics because it's like who cares, but I mean like reception from like fans and people that would just listen to it casually. I was so interested as to how this sector of the music world would perceive it. I believe the first single they released off Youth was The Summer or Roam the Room, and I remember listening and loving what I was hearing, but wasn't sure if others would feel the same. I guess in my head I was thinking something along the lines of, would a kid that loves Man Overboard sit down and be able to enjoy this? But I was pleasantly surprised when I noticed that pretty much everyone who checked out the album had nice things to say about it. I feel like after Youth came out and was positively received, I feel like that opened up a whole new world of music for some people. That was the case for me anyway. And what I mean by that is I feel like kids who only listened to pop punk suddenly became more open to the genres that Citizen was playing around with on Youth. For instance, thanks to the grungy element on Youth, I explored that world a little bit and started to reconsider my thoughts on grunge as a whole. I actually remember something similar happened when Turnover released Peripheral Vision. A lot of kids became more open to the world of shoegaze / dream pop, and some thought that Turnover had single-handedly crafted that style of music. And I know I'm not alone here on this, but it's the best feeling ever to discover an entirely new world of music that you didn't know existed. Different sounds, aesthetics, cultures, attitudes. I remember that's how I felt after discovering artists like Elvis Presley and Sandy Alex G. Citizen's debut was released at an ideal time to the right people in an optimal setting, but those aren't the things that set it apart and give it merit. In fact, you could do all the right things, time everything perfectly, go on all the right tours, etc., and it wouldn't mean a thing if your band's album sucks, because no one would care. But that's the thing about Youth, it doesn't suck. It was a phenomenal record, and people absolutely took notice. There's just so much to love about Youth, right down to the album art. It's minimal, it's beautiful, it gets the point across. The word youth is spelled out in flowers, and when I think of youth in this context, I feel like the name isn't so much referring to the word youth in a general sense. I think the word youth was describing the state of the band itself. And all of this is on a white background, and white represents innocence and purity since this would be their first full-length album. The first thing I really loved about Youth was how gloomy it sounded compared to their previous work. Sure, they've always been kind of a sad band with some sad lyrics and everything, but everything about Youth as a whole seemed a little bit darker, a little bit slower, and the energy was toned down considerably. When comparing this to their older stuff that they've put out, the word detached comes to mind, but in the best way possible. And you see, while the energy was lowered a bit, there are still great tracks on here like Roam the Room and The Summer that are full of vim and vigor that'll get you pumped up, and even some moments on Sleep and The Night I Drove Alone can pack a good punch. With Youth, Citizen was able to take everything that worked for them on their previous releases, play around with those sounds on Youth, and cut away everything that clearly wasn't working. By doing this, they were able to present us a more refined sound in a beautiful, simple package. The straightforwardness of Youth only helps to express Citizen's messages and ideas that much more clearly. In a lot of ways, it feels like Youth wasn't the result of adding, but the result of subtracting. It's not exactly a secret that Matt Kerekes has an outstanding voice, and this record is absolutely no exception. The sad, despondent instruments in the background of the tracks on Youth perfectly complement and enhance Matt's highly emotional, often intense delivery. I really appreciate how cohesive this record is, like each track blends into the next so beautifully, but they don't blend together too much to the point where it just becomes one uninteresting blob, which is a really hard balancing act, but Will Yip and Citizen managed to pull this feat off flawlessly. And just really quick, I want to give some love to Will Yip, the man who produced this record. He's beyond phenomenal and has for sure made some of your favorite records, and he absolutely killed it on Youth. So with Youth, my only criticism is this. I wish there would have been at least one, maybe two more tracks on here that were a little bit more high energy and just a little bit more intense. But other than that, I love this record to death, and if you're watching this, I'm sure we're on the same page. I have the deepest, utmost respect for this band because after they released Youth in 2013, 2013 and spent a full summer on Warped Tour. They easily could have just released Youth Part 2 as their second album, gotten all the reblogs on Tumblr, and more than likely would have been able to ride that wave for the foreseeable future. But no, they made the conscious decision to avoid that route entirely. They chose to experiment. They chose to play around with the sounds they created on Youth and make an earnest attempt to progress as a band and as individual musicians. And that is exactly what they did on Everybody Is Going to Heaven. Youth was the album that put Citizen on the map, and Everybody Is Going to Heaven was the album that authenticated them as true musicians and not just a group of dudes that got lucky with their first album. Citizen is the real deal, and Youth is a really good album. I want to give a special thanks to Matt Kerekes for commenting the word life on one of my Instagram photos 6 years ago. My mates, I appreciate you all so very much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.